The Bracero Program began on August 4, 1942, soon after World War II. On December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor in Honolulu, Hawaii, was surprisingly attacked by the Imperial Japanese Navy Air. Japan struck the United States with plane attacks, killing over 2,300 Americans. This attack led to the United States entering World War II. Thousands of men were sent to war, leaving behind a lot of labor, mainly agricultural labor. In fear of another Great Depression and wanting to ally with Mexico during the war, President Franklin Roosevelt and the United States government reached out to Mexico to start a new guest labor program. This program would benefit both countries. The United States by having provided labor. After the Mexican Revolution in 1910, around 2 million people died, leaving behind many losses. These included low harvest and insufficiency of jobs by 1930. The Bracero Program benefited Mexico by helping it with the struggling economy. On August 4, 1942, the United States signed a Mexican Farm Agreement with Mexico, and the Bracero Program initiated. The Bracero Program would allow Mexican workers to come to the United States as guest workers and work in farms and even railroads for a temporary period of time, until their contracts ended. Each contract was different for each bracero, since the amount of time they worked depended on their employer. These would vary from 30 days to a maximum of 120 days. Many braceros would continuously come back to the United States and renew their contracts. This program allowed more than 4.6 million Mexican citizens to come to the United States and temporarily work. Even though this program was intended to help American farms and factories during World War II, it helped many Mexican citizens to provide for their families. Many of these braceros were escaping poverty and Mexico's struggling economy. The process of becoming a bracero began in contracting stations that were located in specific states in Mexico. Braceros traveled from state to state to find one of these stations where they would sign up to become braceros. They were required to bring identification papers such as birth certificates. They also had to pay officials a fee as well in order to get their paperwork submitted. After they were chosen, braceros would then travel to bigger cities in Mexico that had legal migratory stations. Braceros would wait outside of these stations for hours in hopes of their names being chosen. Once they were selected, they would be taken inside these immigration stations where they would be interviewed by officials and receive medical evaluations. In the interviews, officials would check if they had any agricultural experiences. Their physical evaluations would consist of checking for their physical ability and their physical fitness. These men would also receive a smallpox shot, which was given to them as well once they were in the United States. The United States wanted healthy and strong men to work for them. Once a man had proven they were healthy and they had passed their physical examinations and had been interviewed, they would be taken to the Department of Photography, where their pictures were taken. These pictures would be taken to be kept in records and used for braceros mica. A bracero's mica was an identification card. This card was very important since it was a representation in a way of proving that they had been accepted in the program. After this process was completed, braceros would then be taken to the United States. Many braceros would be taken to the United States by buses, while others traveled in trains. They would arrive to migratory stations in the United States in which they had to go through a longer and more detailed process. In these U.S. migratory stations, they would be fully examined by a doctor. They were required to get fully undressed and would get tested for lice, physical disabilities, and mental diseases. They would also have x-rays taken. Braceros were also fumigated with DDT. DDT became prohibited in 1970 because it became an environmental and health issue. Once braceros had gone through this process, they then began to look for jobs. Usually farmers would stand outside these immigration stations and look for how many braceros they needed and then proceed to taking them to their farms. The first group of braceros was sent to Stockton, California, and began working on September 27, 1942. Each bracero had a contract with the farmers they worked for. Farmers were supposed to respect braceros' rights and complete everything that was listed in their agreements. This included providing housing, food, and taking care of other living expenses of braceros. Most farmers which braceros worked for provided them with housing, which were usually barracks, which were long buildings that usually only had beds in them. They were also supposed to provide braceros with food and take care of their living expenses. Each farmer was different in the ways they treated braceros and the way they followed their agreements. The experiences of braceros all varied from good to horrible. Many braceros were mistreated by not only farmers but Americans as well. Braceros suffered segregation just like African Americans. Braceros were not allowed in many restaurants, and in the ones that were allowed in, they were forced to sit in the back of restaurants and were forced to sit in the upper seats of theaters. Racism like this mostly occurred in Texas, but was also seen all around the country. Racism was not only the only problem braceros faced. They dealt with terrible living conditions as well, and stolen wages. Farmers were required to provide food, housing, and other living expenses for braceros, but many failed to do so. Many farmers took money away from braceros' paychecks to pay for these expenses when they were supposed to pay for these. The living conditions of many braceros were outrageous. The buildings in which they lived in were made from old pieces of metal and were falling apart. Their living space was very limited, and they didn't have much room to move around. They had to share their barracks with up to 200 other braceros. In 1943, the United States came in need of railroad labor. After denying a request for 200 more braceros, Mexico decided to suspend the program due to the poor treatment braceros received. They were not allowing more agreements until the ones made on August 4th of 1942. In hopes of keeping braceros and seeing Mexico was not interested in allowing braceros back in the United States, Clinton Anderson, the Honorable of Mexico, reached out to the department, the War Food Administration, and the administration agency of his government because he believed that they would have a better approach and a bigger impact on Mexico agreeing if they saw that braceros would not receive better treatment. After the United States agreed on bettering the treatment, Mexico agreed on extending the program. Soon after this, braceros began to receive better treatment for their employers. They got paid what they deserved and their living conditions improved.
This is Lorenzo Cervantes. He is just one of the millions of braceros who came to the United States through the Bracero Program for a better future. He was a bracero from 1963 to 1964. He says that he signed up in Sonora, Mexico, and he was then brought to the United States, which he worked in Texas and California. He worked in Texas for about 4 months, and he was then brought to California, in which he worked in Stockton farm for 6 months. He recalls his experience as an excellent experience. He explains how farmers had everything ready for when the braceros came. They had a place for him to live in, a big dining room, and excellent treatment. As he recalls them grandes rancheros, meaning that they were great farmers. He remembers seeing all the braceros happy because of all the opportunities they were given and granted. Many of them got to help their families and provide a better life for them in Mexico. He felt like his rights and contract was always protected. Farmers followed all the agreements and their contracts, and Cervantes said that he had a salary of $5 per hour. They were all great, he says, when they were asked about the farmers he worked for, as he recalls them grandes rancheros. He will always remember and carry the amazing things he experienced through this program, as he told us many of his stories through laughter and huge smiles.
On July of 1951, President Truman signed off a new agreement in which the U.S. government would make the contracts and not the farm employers, and the program was extended. He also made it for a felony for farmers to employ an illegal immigrant. This new agreement stated that the U.S. government would make agreements for braceros with the Mexican government. This law set the norms and regulations for how the program ran all the way to 1964, which was when it ended. Many Americans did not agree with this program. They believed their jobs were being taken from them by braceros. Therefore, in the new agreement, braceros could not replace American workers who were on strike. Braceros themselves were not allowed to strike. After the film Harvest of Shame that came out in 1960, President Kennedy was convinced that braceros were affecting American citizens' wages, their working conditions, and their employment opportunities. The program ended on December 31st of 1964, even after farmers' attempts to continue the program. Through this program, many braceros were able to get permanent residency in the United States, while many became American citizens. Ever since this program, there hasn't been anything like this. An attempt was made on January 7th of 2004 when President Bush gave the idea of changing immigration policies by releasing a new temporary work program. In the proposed program, people would have to meet the United States labor market needs and come to temporarily work in the United States. In 2008, a lawsuit started because many braceros were not paid the money that was taken from them during the program. After a long trial, the United States agreed to pay back braceros $3,500 each. They were able to pay back 40,000 braceros and are able to pay 35,000 more braceros. The Bracero Program left good labor market relationships between Mexico and the United States, and it was a program that benefited both countries.